Hello, I'm Dan Barbezat, economics professor at Amherst College, and specialize and I'm really interested in world history, economic history in particular, of course. And this little video is an introduction to what has happened over a very, very long time to growth and distribution across the planet. So I've entitled this A Short History of World Economic History, kind of funny title. It's a big topic, but I hope we can get the main ideas in a relatively short time. So this is a now quite famous figure from a book by Gregory Clark from University of California, Davis. And what he's done here is he's shown the year on the horizontal axis and income per person indexed for 1800 equaling 1. Which is that horizontal line there above 0. And what this kind of shows you is that for a very, very long period of time, for over 3,000 years, the income per person on the planet was relatively stable. It is true that it rises and falls over that very long period, but comparing, let's say, year 100 to year 1,000, there's not a lot of difference in median per capita incomes. That is to say, if you put the poorest person and the richest person, the person right there in the middle didn't change that much. And more importantly, that value didn't change that much if you looked at those times anywhere in the world. Okay, but you can see something starts to happen after 1500. And what starts to happen after 1500 is in some areas of the world, there is unprecedented per capita income growth. And what that's meant is that that sustained growth has led to standards of living that have never been known by median level incomes on the planet. And there is incredible disparity among incomes. And so those are the two things. In this little video, we're going to look at those things. Very long, stable equilibrium, a disturbance of that equilibrium to sustain growth, and then this increase in inequality in the world. So this is population, which looks very, very much like the figure from before. And the reason is quite simple, right? In order to sustain larger populations, you need higher incomes. And so we'll look at this and what might be driving incomes and population across the planet and the consequences of that in this and the session we have together in June. Here, as I've broken out the periods. So this is the period we had before, that Malthusian period. And you can see this is from about 1435. This is right after the Black Death, so in Europe at least. So this is in England. So this is relatively high per capita incomes that return to a kind of equilibrium, and then with changes that we'll be talking about, start to rise. So this is kind of this is part of the Malthusian equilibrium we looked at before, that long, stable part. And then there's this transition, a transitionary period, and then this modern growth period. So this is what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at this period and these periods and trying to get a sense of how did this happen and to understand the consequences of them. This is I thought this might be interesting for you in that you can see that there's something very radically different happened between population growth and output growth in very developed areas and less developed areas. And it's quite striking that in Western offshoots, that is to say, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you get this output growth that looks like anywhere else. It looks like it does in Africa, it looks like in Latin America, Western Europe, but something radically different is with population growth. Note that with that large increase in output growth in the Western offshoots and Western Europe, there was a very sharp decrease in population growth that did not occur in Africa and Latin America, which had very large consequences. This is, again, that idea of long, stable equilibrium, increasing growth in some parts of the planet. So you can see prior to 1820, all these areas look very, very similar. But after 1820, through the 19th century into the 20th centuries, you get this increase in variation, which means that today we live on a planet with a higher level of income inequality for median level incomes than has ever existed in human history. This again shows a very similar kind of thing. You get these differentiations between growth economies like in England as against France and Austria. And then you can see India, this small little area right there is India. Okay, so that whereas in the beginning of 1630, England, France, and Austria very similar. England rises, France and Austria doesn't, and India stays relatively low. This should make you think a little bit about industrialization and global trade, which it should, and we will when we meet one another and talk in person. Here, once again, just to sort of give you all the data I could do in a very short period of time. Again, this incredible divergence that occurred. You can see in 1700, incomes relative to the cost of subsistence, what it takes to remain a healthy life, not that different in Beijing and London. But then over the 19th and 20th centuries, radical differences in these the amount of income each individual in England had relative to the Chinese. And that had profound implications in terms of their economic welfare, their longevity, and so forth. And so this idea of a long, stable equilibrium, a transition to modern growth, and a great divergence in per capita incomes is what we really are interested in explaining here. So this is that again, just the stark differences in per capita incomes. This is from World Bank data, and you get look at the high OECD countries relative to the low income countries. I mean, these differences are, what is large? I don't know what that means, but the difference between $567 in purchasing power parity to $41,000, and this is some years ago, should make you think about nothing else for the week until the time we see you. This is very profound differences, and the consequences to human beings and to all beings is very high. Okay, so you might be thinking like, okay, good, I get it that the income was relatively stable for a long time. There was some kind of change. Some areas grew, some didn't. What could possibly account for that? Well, it's pretty complicated, okay? So there's a lot of dynamic effects that go into this growth process. But let's just look at a way to look at a very simple set of variables and see if we can isolate what really matters. So here you have in front of you a complicated looking formula. And I'll have another video that derives this little formula for you, for those interested. But for now, this is a relationship between on the left-hand side there. So this small equation here tries to capture one aspect of the factors that can account for these differences. Just before I go on, let me say that, of course, there are many other factors, imperialism and foreign policy and all sorts of aspects that, of course, have to be taken into account. And we'll talk about those in our session together. But here, in terms of just the simple, direct economics of it, can we have a growth accounting to look at what might matter in terms of these differences? So on the left-hand side, we have, this is output, and this is N is the population. So this is output per capita, okay? And K is capital and Y is output. So this is the capital to output ratio. E is a kind of a notion like an index that shows how productive factors are in terms of output. And L is labor over population. That's the employment rate. Okay, and alpha over 1 minus alpha are the fallout of a production function that I'll talk about in the little video. But let's look at this together and see if we can look at these three variables, K over Y, E, and L over N, and see which contributes to output per capita the most. So here we have some data of capital output ratios. And really, it makes sense that relatively wealthier countries have more capital in terms of their output, but only about 4 times higher in very wealthy economies relative to relatively poor economies, okay? The employment rate is about the same. I mean, everyone's got to work everywhere. So there's a little bit of an uptick, but really it's about the same everywhere on the planet. So what we're seeing is that L over N is not counting for much. K over Y a little bit. If we look at the next slide, we'll see that, look, Y over N is 30 to 40 times higher for wealthy countries to relatively poor countries. K over Y to the 1/2, that's alpha over 1 minus alpha, if alpha were 1/3, for a variety of technical reasons, that's usually given there. That means it's only 2 times as higher. That means L over N was about the same. K over Y to the 1/2 is 2 times. That means that E must be about 20 times higher in the wealthy countries relative to the poorer countries. What could account for these? That's great. What could account for these? What could account for these differences in E? Here are some of that first should be political, social, economic, and demographic, not just demographic history that follows down the bottom. Factor endowments, factor prices, institutions, schooling, culture. All of these might account in what might be considered total factor productivity. So really, thinking about long-run growth is really thinking a lot about this factor E. And that's what we're going to do together when we have our time in June. So I hope this has helped give you a kind of an introduction to what we're doing. We're going to look at this long-run equilibrium with not a lot of change, and then something starts to occur. There starts to be some change in some places, leading to rapid growth in some places, but not that growth in other places, which means that we end up with an incredibly unequal world in terms of distribution.